Hey everyone, hope you're doing wonderfully well. Today, I'm bringing you the Danish Gambit. This gambit is packed with traps and beautiful sacrifices, so get ready, because even if you don't leave this video convinced to play the Danish Gambit, you at least see some of the most beautiful positions chess has to offer. Let's get started. We begin with pawn to e4, pawn to e5, and then we play d4, offering our opponent the chance to capture our central pawn. Instead of recapturing, which would lead to the center game, we play pawn to c3, giving them the opportunity to take a second pawn and secure at least a one-pawn advantage. So they capture and we play bishop to c4. By doing this, we give our opponent a chance to grab a second pawn by taking on b2. That allows us to develop our bishop and place both beautiful bishops on long diagonals, making it hard for black to develop. Our bishop on b2 puts pressure on the g7 pawn. For example, they can't comfortably move that bishop without hanging the pawn, and eventually the rook. Our bishop on c4 puts pressure on f7, and in many positions, you'll end up sacrificing it there. If they keep developing the knight, we can push the pawn to kick it out right away. The black player ends up in a pretty uncomfortable position. The most common reply is bishop to b4 with check. Most white players will block the check by playing knight to c3, but that puts the knight in front of the bishop on b2, which limits its activity. I recommend blocking the check with knight to d2 instead. It does the same job, but it keeps your bishop fully active along the long diagonal. Then your opponent will likely play knight to f6, threatening the pawn since its defender, your knight on d2, is pinned. In this position, you can go for the sequence bishop takes f7, followed by queen to b3, hitting both the queen and the bishop on b4. This is actually the most popular line in the database. It's perfectly playable for white and leads to a favorable win rate since black has to play fast in the center and will likely mess up somewhere along the way. But that's not the line I'm going to recommend. Instead, I suggest pushing the pawn when they play knight to f6 rather than sacrificing the bishop right away. It's a very common move. You'll want to go for it almost every time to develop the knight to f6. When you play pawn to e5, you put your opponent in a tough spot. There's no good square for that knight. Going back to g8 would be a disaster, like he's resetting the pieces for the next game. He also can't go to h5, g4, or d5 because we control all of those squares. So the only option is e4. And now that tactic I told you to avoid earlier, it works beautifully. And you'll see why in a second. Because after bishop takes on f7, king takes f7, and queen to b3 check, our opponent will block the check the same way as in the yellow line, with pawn to d5. But this time, we have a pawn on e5 that can capture en passant, and that's exactly what they won't see coming. He's expecting queen takes bishop. After all, that's why you made the maneuver, right? It's a great position to play. You gain a solid positional edge since your opponent has to give up castling in exchange for just a pawn. You also recover one of the two pawns you sacrificed by capturing the f7 pawn. But if you go ahead and capture en passant, we'll actually level the material on the board, and from here, we've got a devastating attack lined up. A sequence so strong, I guarantee your opponent will report you after the game thinking you must be cheating. They'll likely play bishop to e6. It's the most natural move to block the check and gain tempo on your queen. Now you can go ahead and take their bishop on b4. Since the knight is under attack, the natural reply is to trade it for your knight on d2. Retreating the knight would leave the king stuck in the center and risk letting you capture on c7. What they don't realize is that taking the knight on d2, though it's the most common move, is actually a mistake. We're not going to take the knight with the king or with the queen. Instead, we go for a brilliant sequence starting with queen to f4, check, which also defends our pawn. After they move the king, whether to g8 or e8, g8 being more common, we can capture on c7, hitting both the queen and the knight. And the knight we passed on earlier, we can still take it later. They have no checks, no captures, no counterplay. In fact, we're about to win a massive amount of material just by following logical, natural moves. They'll probably play queen to e8. That's the most common move, trying to set up some kind of discovered attack with the bishop on e6. And obviously, you'd be fine just taking the knight and promoting to a queen. No discovered checks matter here because you can simply take their queen right after. So yeah, definitely a favorable position for white. But here's a sequence you won't believe. Instead of taking the knight, you've got a stunning in-between move, queen to e5, threatening mate on g7 and shutting down any tricks they might have with the discovered check. Besides that, you're pinning the bishop because it's shielding the queen. And after your opponent defends the checkmate, something most players probably won't even notice, by playing a move like queen to f7, then you go in, take the knight, and promote to a queen. Now you're in a totally winning position with beautiful, clean moves. Alright, now let's take a look at a few other variations your opponents might try if they avoid the main lines. Bishop to b4 is by far the most common move, and you'll see lines very similar to what we just played. But what if they go straight for knight to f6? In that case, e5 is your clearest, most straightforward response, kicking the knight right away. It's strong for all the reasons we already discussed. If the knight retreats to g8, that's terrible for black. So they'll likely play knight to e4. But that move actually looks like it loses immediately, because now you've got queen to d5 hitting multiple targets. So queen to f5 is the most common move for white. It threatens the knight and also checkmate. But black can defend with knight to g5. And if you try to chase that knight with f4 or h4, it can fall back to h6 and sit there, defending against the mate threat. That leaves black in a very comfortable position to play. So instead of going for the obvious line with pawn to e5 and knight to e4, here's a really beautiful sequence you can go for. Bishop takes on f7. After they recapture, you follow up with queen to d5 check, and then take the knight right after. The king usually tucks back to e8, and that's when you grab the knight. White ends up with a position that's much easier to play strategically, thanks to a clear lead in space and development, while black is left with an exposed king and disconnected pieces. Another line you can go for is queen's f3 check. This forces the knight to retreat to f6, so you can continue the attack. Your opponent's king ends up even more centralized than before. You do give back a pawn to keep that king stuck in the center, but in the process, you wrecked their pawn structure. So this is an alternative to queen to d5. I still recommend queen to d5 over queen to f3, but just be aware it's an option. Another move you'll often see is pawn to d6. Black plays this to prepare knight to f6 without giving us the chance to push e5 and kick the knight away. But honestly, pawn to d6 isn't a great move. It's passive, it locks in the bishop behind the pawn chain, and it doesn't help development. Black won't be able to castle. It's one of the most passive setups they can go for, and that means we'll get a quick advantage here too. So what should you play? Just develop your knight to f3 and keep bringing your pieces into the game. Queen to b3 puts pressure on f7, which is a key target in many lines. But what happens next depends on how black responds. The most common move is bishop to e6, probably to avoid all those typical sacrifices on f7 you've just seen. But playing bishop to e6 actually puts black at a big disadvantage because it seriously weakens the b7 pawn. We can just take that bishop and later use queen to b3 to target both e6 and b7. Black tries to defend both with queen to c8, but once we attack that pawn again, it's gonna fall. So here we play knight to g5, and we're getting back the material we sacrificed plus interest, because this position is already hugely favorable for white. You'll often see black respond with king to e7, desperate to hold on to material. Beginner level players tend to be very materialistic, and here he's running his king into the center, giving up castling rights, blocking his own bishop and his own knight. And if we evaluate the position here, the engine already gives white a 3-point lead. Whether you just castle and ignore the mess, push the pawn to d5, or go ahead and sacrifice the knight on d6. Because if it captures it with the queen, b7 will fall next, and then so will the rook. Here's another position that's completely winning in just a few moves. And if instead of bishop to e6, black plays bishop to g4 to pin our knight, that's also a mistake because of the same thematic sacrifices we've already seen. He's doing it out of desperation to trade pieces. Since he's up 2 pawns, he thinks the endgame favors him. But that's the wrong mindset. To survive here, he should be playing much more actively. He's placing his pieces on better squares now, instead of just reacting. In this position, there's a line with a bishop takes on f7, but when the king recaptures, you actually don't gain anything. Because if you try a discovered check with knight to g5, he just captures the knight, which also defends his bishop. You gave up a piece for nothing. But the reason this line works now is because the d-pawn, which should protect e5, is actually pinned, since the queen isn't properly defending. So you continue with knight to e5 check, forking the king and the bishop, recovering the material you sacrificed, and ruining black's ability to castle in the process. And once again, white ends up with a clearly better position in just a few moves. Finally, let's take a look at what to do if your opponent plays another common move, knight to c6. This move feels a bit counterintuitive. You'll see it more often at higher levels because with the black pieces, players usually want to castle and get the king out of the center. So why develop on the queen side first? Well, it's because they're aiming to play bishop to b4. But they also know that if the bishop lands on b4 undefended, there's that classic bishop takes on f7 followed by queen to b3, winning material. Now with the knight on c6, bishop to b4 comes with protection, and the sacrifice on f7 doesn't work anymore. This is probably one of your opponent's strongest responses, so let's learn how to deal with it. I recommend continuing development with knight to c3. He'll play bishop to b4. That's the whole reason he brought the knight to c6. Now instead of defending with knight to d2, defend with the knight on c3 because eventually you'll want to bring it to the d5 square. There's a little trap here. He probably won't take the knight since that will leave your bishop pair completely uncontested. So instead, he'll keep developing with knight to f6. And this time, I'm not going to suggest pushing the pawn to e5 right away, even though it wouldn't be a bad move because the bishop takes on f7 ideas aren't as effective with that knight sitting on c6, so there's no real reason to force it right now. I recommend you just castle. He'll probably castle too. Then you go knight to d5. And even when black plays accurately, they still have to make difficult choices. At this point, black is already under serious pressure. Black is under pressure here on the f6 square. He can't just make any move. If he does, you'll take the knight and force his king out into the open. This position is very favorable for white. He also can't move the knight from c6 because then you'd take the bishop, which is also under attack. The most natural move is to trade knights, but that's a huge mistake because we recapture with the pawn, which is key, kicking the knight from c6. Now you see why that knight needs to be on c6 for this tactic to work. And once it goes to e7, we play queen to e5, threatening mate. It's incredibly difficult to defend this as black. In fact, white has a forced wing here. He might try playing f6. But if he does, you simply push the pawn to d6 with check. Another way to stop the mate on g7 is with knight to f5. And if he defends with a stronger move, knight to f5, which defends g7 and also attacks your queen on d3, you just bring your queen to g4, threatening the knight, which is undefended, while still keeping the pressure on g7. If he tries to defend the knight, you just keep attacking it. A simple move like bishop to d3 threatens to capture the knight and then deliver mate, and he's got no good options. This position is totally lost for black. Again, all within the first moves of the opening, even when black plays well. That's it for today, folks. I hope you enjoyed the video and learned something new. Don't forget to subscribe. Take care, and I'll see you next time.